Welcome to the 12th District. I'm Kerry Condata for NCW Life TV. Well, I'd like to say there's good news out there, but we haven't found a lot. We're going to switch today from politics back to economics because that is the big concern right now. The number one issue in the nation is inflation and all the related costs, of course, fuel costs being a big part of that. We will have Mark Harmsworth from the Washington Policy Center in our second segment to talk about the small business catastrophe that's happening in Washington State. It's across the nation, but it's worse here, and we'll tell you why with Mark Harmsworth in the second segment. All right, we'll be right back with some late economic news, and then we'll get on to Mark. And, well, I wish I could bring you better news, but we'll do our best. All right, we're back with some news, a little bit of economic news. In a moment, we're going to be talking to Mark Harmsworth from the Washington Policy Center about this perfect storm that is just crushing small business, particularly in Washington State. It's not easy on anybody at what's going on in the nation right now, but Washington State is really, really bad. So we'll get that report in just a moment. Let's take a look at consumer prices. April up at 8.3% annual. That's a little softer than what it was. I think it was 8.6, but it's not good. 8.3, but when you take the core inflation rate, it doubled. The core inflation is groceries and fuel. It went from 0.3, this is per month, not annually, to 0.6, and that was in April. As most of you know, in May, gas prices have continued their increase pretty dramatically, and that has prompted a diesel fuel surcharge on all shipping of about 25%, so we're adding 25% to the cost of all shipping of all items across the United States. And it is prompting some issues with the trains as well. The train folks are having a hard time keeping up, moving freight, and of course that's moving fuel, so there may be even more food or fuel shortages on the horizon. Stock market continues its downward trend and is now moving towards a 52-week low on the Dow Jones Industrial Average as well as the S&P and other indexes. Some of those major companies have already hit 52-week lows, some big names out there, and are continuing to go down. Interest rates, as you know, we're looking for another hike. We just had one, and we're watching the 30-year mortgage rate move well above 5%, and probably closing in on 6 by the 4th of July is what we predict if there is another half-point increase, which is assumed. And the housing market, though, is starting to react. If there's any little bit of light on the horizon, and I'm sorry, there isn't much. The housing market does seem to be starting to flatten off just a little bit. I mean, that's a good thing for affordability. It's a bad thing, I guess, if you're in an equity position. One of the other interesting news stories is that more school levies are failing. One in Tri-Cities failed and one in Marysville just failed. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that the property taxes just can't go much higher with housing prices and the interest rates climbing. That's another cost they just can't get. And of course, the biggest story consistently is the crime, increase in crime, drugs. We're seeing it right here in the Valley. And police are leaving some of the major cities in record numbers. Pierce County just added $10,000 bonus to the remaining police officers to try to retain some of those police officers. And of course, Seattle is offering large pay and benefit increases to try to get anybody that would come to Seattle and work in that business. Okay, a quick follow-up from last week. We talked about minimum wage a bit. It was part of our story, and we're going to include that in the next segment. But the minimum wage is considerably different here than anywhere else in the states that we traveled the last few weeks. Washington is at $14.49, the only place that's higher in terms of a state, or in this case, it's Washington, D.C., is $15 in Washington, D.C., which is more of a city than a state. Some of the cities do have $15 plus minimum wages, but as states go, we are way up there at $14.49. Oregon has a graduated system, which is pretty clever. I introduced the same bill in the Washington legislature and got shot down, but they vary from $13.50 in the cities, and in eastern Oregon, it's $11.50, so they do it by region. Idaho is at the federal rate, $7.25. Nevada is at $8. Utah is at $7.25. Arizona is at $12.15. And Montana's at $8.75. So you can see at $14.49 we're at a substantial labor cost difference to all the other states. That might explain why restaurants and things were much lower priced in the other states that we traveled through. This is the highest probably place in the U.S., short of maybe New York, to go out to dinner. A couple things about minimum wage just to finish on here. It's kind of an interesting fact that in 1980, 15% of the people in this country were on minimum wage. That's 1980. Now, in 2020, how many do you think that is? You'd be shocked. Only 2% of the people in the United States today are on minimum wage, and in Washington State, only 1%. So maybe that minimum wage situation isn't such a big deal. 29 states actually have a minimum wage above the federal, and the lowest is Wyoming and Georgia at $5.15, and the highest, as we said, was Washington, D.C. So there you have it. By the way, food service is the #1 place for minimum wage. Farming is no longer in the top 10. Used to be. Most people working in farms now are well above the minimum wage. So we're going to discuss that further when we come back with Mark Harmsworth, our small business expert from the Washington Policy Center. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the 12th District. Well, continuing our discussion on small business, which is a critical situation right now, we have joining us today Mark Harmsworth from the Washington Policy Center. Mark's been with us before, and he is certainly an expert on small business. And Mark, welcome aboard. Good to have you back.
Well, thanks for having me on again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'll tell you, we just had a recent survey, and we've seen so many different surveys on business climate, but we've just had one that I think really hits home, and that says we're 46th in the United States in business climate. And of course, the difference with that survey was it was based on interviewing actual business people instead of using fixed metrics, because these reports we see with fixed metrics never seem to include the B&O tax, and we look really good. It almost looks like we're a tax-free business state because the B&O tax is unique. But this one really hit home because they talked to people that do business in multiple states, and they said Washington's a train wreck. So we kind of agree, but today we want to go a little further. We know Washington on the baseline is a train wreck, but it's worse now. Look at all the other things, the inflation, the shipping costs. So tell me a little bit about your experience right now in the small world of small business.
Right. Well, not only do I do work for the Policy Center, I own a small business. I have employees. I sign the backside of the check so they can get paid. And I'm telling you, it's tough out there. There's all sorts of problems, and we're going to cover a lot of those here today. But just, you already touched on B&O tax. That is the tax that just keeps on taxing, because it's every phase of the line, for those who are not familiar, it's on gross income. So I can make $1 million as a business, and I can lose $2 million, and they still want $1 million of B&O tax on that $1 million. So it's a horrible tax, and we certainly need reform there. What we're seeing right now, though, is things driving the cost of products up. We've all been to the grocery store. We've all been to the gas pump. We've seen, I'm paying $5.50 per just regular gas right now. I have a pickup, and I spent $130 filling it up the other day. It's a big tank, but you know, my eyes popped when I saw the thing roll over $100 there. It's tough, you know. And I've got engineers driving around, and I'm spending money on fuel, and it's just driving the cost of everything up. Well, I can't afford to just keep eating that cost. I have to increase the cost of my customers. And that's really what's going on in the supply chain as well. What we're seeing is, and many of my suppliers, and I buy a lot of network equipment. My business is an IT services company. So we buy a lot of network equipment, as you would imagine, firewalls, computers, and all these types of things. All of my suppliers now are putting surcharges on their delivery fees, which I then have to pass on to my customers. We've got issues with, and that's primarily been driven by the cost of diesel. As much as we're paying more money for that gas, those truck drivers who are spending $1,000, $2,000 filling their tanks up, both tanks on a big rig, they're having to put that surcharge now back on the customers that they're delivering product for. And so what's happening is that cost then gets passed back to us as the purchasers. And as a small business, I may buy 5 or 6 pieces of a network equipment to install into your business so you can get on the internet and watch this fabulous show. But instead, I now have to charge you 15, 20% more. And some people are just saying, hey, I can't afford it right now because I'm the last one on the chain, and they're not doing the work. So it's affecting my bottom line.
Well, and this is why we call it the perfect storm. It hits from both sides. Your input costs are going up, so you have to raise prices. But at the same time, discretionary income is dropping because, as you said, when you put $120 in your gas tank, that's money that would be for maybe a restaurant or going out to eat or purchasing equipment. So you're seeing a definite slowdown. My local small businesses are seeing a pretty substantial slowdown in purchasing, and at the same time, their costs are going up. It's a catastrophe waiting to happen. And I'm not sure a lot of them are going to survive. And then, let's talk about the other inputs. Interest rates. Businesses borrow. They use credit cards. They do these things, and that's going to go up as well. And it's just the list goes on and on and on. Is there a short-term solution? I mean, the supply line is a big part of it too, because now the trains are having problems getting product. What is the solution to this? Is there a solution?
Well, there's a couple things here that are driving some of these transportation costs, particularly in the trucking industry. You're seeing a shortage of truck drivers. That's piling on top of some of the diesel taxes that you're seeing on fuel for them to deliver it as well. You've also got some companies and particularly government agencies that are going through vaccine mandates. And what that is causing is a lack of employees. And so you've got, and I'll just use a transit agency because it's an easy example. Community Transit laid off 40 of its employees last year. Because they had religious exemptions, but they decided they wanted to not have the vaccine, so they were laid off according to company policy. Well, they had to cut their service. They decreased the frequency of the buses, and they cut their service. Well, you're seeing this in other areas too. A trucking company that doesn't have its drivers, doesn't have enough drivers to get that product to you, has less trucks on the road. And that's demand and supply, basic demand and supply. Now, to get your product on that truck, you're fighting for space. And you've seen some of the problems at FedEx. If you've used FedEx in the last 6 months, you've seen them really struggling with this. Delays on products being delivered, which then drives up the cost for a lot of this stuff. Cities like Seattle, just to make it even worse, they slap on a hazard pay. So you've got minimum wage, you've got hazard pay being thrown on there. And that's driving up even more costs. And the politicians that believe these types of things are a good thing because they're either looking to improve the environment or they're trying to help folks just make some extra money. What it's actually doing, they think this money comes from nowhere. Well, it doesn't. The small business owner like myself, we have to pass that on to the consumer because eventually we make no money. We're not a business anymore. We're the government at that point. So, we can't do that. So these costs just keep coming up, and it's incremental, and it hurts. It hurts the lower income folks the most because they're the ones that have least disposable income. And you cut out, you're talking about cutting out a restaurant. For some people, that's cutting out bread. It's cutting out, maybe some meat at the weekend, and they're just using pasta. So that it's a horrible situation, and it's. We definitely need to be looking at our gas tax right now, which is going to be one of the highest in the nation by January, if not the highest, with our carbon taxes. We could do a gas tax holiday. That's been a proposal by several folks. And there's several things we can do around B&O tax reform and holding sales taxes down as much as we can. That'll help with that disposable income side of things.
You hit on another big elephant in the room that is just a little bit mind-boggling from you and I both have economics backgrounds. This labor shortage is hard to figure out. Where do these people go? Now, I traveled 7 states. I found out one thing. It's a lot cheaper to buy things in other states, from alcohol to food. It is cheaper. But the universal thing that happened in all 7 states is there is a labor shortage. In every restaurant, every store, everybody's posting, and they're limiting their hours. What is going on with labor shortage when you have, for one thing, you've got some unlimited immigration. Where are all these people going? What's driving this labor shortage?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and it's sort of at both ends of the employment age span. When COVID hit 2 years ago, you had a lot of people that were due to retire in the next 3 to 4 years. And they were sent home in COVID, and they just looked at it all and said, you know what, I can probably afford to retire at this point. I've paid into my pension. I'll get less money, but I'm just going to call it quits. I just don't want to deal with this anymore, and what have you. So you had a bunch of folks on the older end of the spectrum, and the twilight of their years, as they would say, who decided that, we're just going to call it quits early. So those folks left the workforce. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the government paying us to stay home. So you had a lot of young people who maybe weren't making as much money as you would do a little later in life as you've built your career and experience up. And the unemployment benefits were, they exceeded the money they were making in their jobs. My own daughter, this happened to her. She got laid off right at the beginning of COVID, and she took one employment check before I said to her, nope, you're getting a job. So she had to go find a job. But that check was, I think, a third more than she actually made as an individual. And so now we're starting to go back to work, but those jobs from the top end are still empty. So you're seeing people migrate into those roles. There's a shortage there. And then people are deciding to stay home because they're like, I just don't want to deal with this anymore. And they're quite happy to claim that unemployment as long as they possibly can.
But of course, those programs, I think that was another shocker, is those programs ended. The $300 went away. The unemployment ran out for a lot of people, and it didn't seem to change the situation. I'm just still a little bit boggled by this. And my local businesses say, even if they can hire somebody, they last sometimes a week and they're gone. They just don't have any work ethic. So they're just, that's yep. Another big piece of this is getting people. There's a restaurant up in a town north of here that basically it's a brand new setup. They're beautifully managed. They've had to limit their hours to dinner only because they can't get anybody to work. It's just amazing. So that's another thing that we're facing. It's just, like I said, it's coming from every side. I mean, there is nothing good happening for small business right now, right?
I'm struggling even in my industry to hire. I was lucky enough to pull someone in, and they'd be joining us here in the next month or so. But it's a tough market. And the other thing with inflation is it now drives up the cost of the salaries because in order for your employees to be able to buy that expensive milk, gas, and whatever, you now have to pay them more, and that just exacerbates the problem even further.
Well, we talked earlier in this show in the first segment about minimum wage, and it is fascinating to see the difference. We are by far the outlier. Only Washington, D.C. and Washington, ironically, the two Washingtons have the highest minimum wage. All of our competitive states are significantly lower. But here's the part when I was doing this research that really threw me a curve. The percentage of people in Washington state on minimum wage is 1%. It's 1%. We talk about it all the time, how big deal. It's getting people out of poverty. It's this, that. It's 1%. It really isn't that big a deal. And the fact is, it's driving the wage ladder. And I don't see a reduction in poverty. I don't see less homeless. There's a heck of a lot more homeless people in Washington than there is in Arizona, or at least in Utah, that I could see.
These minimum wage jobs were always intended, or the lower end jobs were always intended as a temporary or an adjunct type of employment. So there's a couple things happening here. Kids that would go work at Starbucks or McDonald's during the summer while they were on the summer break, McDonald's doesn't want to hire them anymore because they've got to pay them $15 an hour. And they would rather hire somebody older with more experience who's going to stick around because it costs a lot of money to hire an employee. So those summer jobs are starting to go away now, and it's becoming more difficult for those young folks to find those roles. And then as an employer, I've got people that maybe were making $20 an hour, and now I bring in somebody with no experience of 15. That's a horrible thing you have to do. So I have to increase the experienced employee salaries. They feel that they're loved in their role, which they've put their time in, which drives up my costs even further. Or they can just look at it and go, you know what? I don't need to be trained anymore. I can go work at McDonald's for $15 an hour and just work 9 to 5 or do the shift that they want to do. So these jobs were never supposed to be. They call it a living wage job. Well, no, they're not. They were jobs to help you get up the ladder so you can improve and get training and move into a job that is a living wage job.
And of course, automation's coming in so many areas too. The number one purchasing for businesses in the first quarter of this year nationwide was automation. And, computers and technology as well, but automation was at the top of the list. So we have essentially distorted this economy to a point where I'm not sure how we get it back. It is out of whack in every way, shape, and form. Any other ideas moving forward? I mean, we got to get the energy prices down. There's no doubt about that. But beyond that, is there any end to this cycle, this vicious downhill cycle?
So one of the things we need to do is create a training wage so that those kids can get back in. So do internships and those types of things where there's the minimum wage requirements and some of the other things have gone on, like the hazard pay. And then you're seeing them now try to unionize Uber and Lyft because they want salaries. And the whole point of Uber and Lyft, if you were a driver, was that you had flexibility. And now they're trying to put you in this sort of permanent employee role. So we need to do things like that. We need to reform our B&O tax. As I mentioned earlier, it's on gross. Everything trickles down on the small business. So if you can fix that problem, you can reduce the cost of your product, and then we can see things start stabilizing.
The amazing thing, again, about B&O tax is you're raising prices, which increases your gross sales, which is what it's based on, but your input costs go up, so your margins are smaller. Now, most of the other states, when we looked at tax structure, virtually every one of our competitive states on the West Coast has a corporate income tax or something based on income. We're the outlier again. So I would agree. I would hope there will be some changes this fall in Olympia and possibly in the United States to start looking at this situation, because I don't think small business has any future in Washington State at the rate it's going. I'm sure you agree.
I'm not giving up yet.
Okay.
It is definitely tough. I'll tell you that. Small business owners, you're the one that says, we're short this month, I'm not taking a check. And, a lot of people don't understand. It's literally my checking account that the money's going in and out of. And so when they say, well, you make all this money per year, I said, yeah, but I'm paying all these salaries and I pay the rent and I buy the product and all these things. It doesn't work like these big mega corporations that everyone thinks it is. It's, it's me and the guys and gals that work with me.
Well, that's true. And last but not least, I think it is interesting that there is a huge migration to Idaho and Utah, are two of the fastest growing economies in the states. And there was a report today that was pretty amazing from South Dakota. They have less than 1,000 people on unemployment insurance at this point, and their manufacturing base is growing leaps and bounds. Obviously, they're doing something different than Washington State. Well,
the governor's very pro-business there, so
yep.
They're attracting the right types of people.
Well, I hope we can make that happen here at some point. Mark, thanks for being with us today, and we'll get back to you soon. We'll get a follow-up maybe in a few months and see what happens. I don't like the direction it's going. I'm concerned, but we'll keep in touch, and thanks for being with us today.
You bet. Thanks for having me on, Carrie.
All right. Well, there you have it. It's a perfect storm, not a good one, and I think we're going to be losing some small businesses, quite a few, if things continue. We'll be right back to wrap it up here on the 12th District. All right, well, there you have it, the perfect storm 2, so to speak. It's getting worse, not better, and there isn't an easy way out of this. We'll keep you posted on the economic information next week. Coming up on filing week, we'll set the table for the elections this fall, know who's running, who's not running, who has opponents, and who doesn't. That's coming up soon. We hope you'll stay with us here every week on the 12th District. Don't forget our local news at 5, 6, and 10 o'clock every night. This is Kerry Condata for NCW Life. We'll see you next week.